So one thing that we need to keep in mind, and we always need to keep in mind, is that we really have this positive goal. We want to see ourselves positively. And what's really interesting is that in recent years, research has found that this is a fundamental need. We need to have a stable, positive sense of self. And it knowing that in and of itself, I think answers a lot of questions that we might have about not only consumers but people in general, right? So it's like dating, right? So if you've ever been on the quote unquote market dating and you meet people who objectively aren't in the best shape, right? So, they don't have a job, they can't pay any of their bills, and it's not COVID related. It's just that, they aren't really that ambitious. They got very little going on. And you're thinking, why does this person think that, they should be on the dating market, and that they're a winner, and that people will automatically want them, and part of it is that we have a positive sense of self, and that's driven by the fact that we have this fundamental need to maintain a positive sense of self. The question becomes, how do we explain this? How do we go about, you or I go about maintaining a positive sense of self when we have so many negative things going on in our lives? And the fact of the matter is, a lot of us have things that detract us from other people, right? Or other people or society or whatever would say are objectively not great things to have. But we have this high, sense of self, this positive self concept. How do we maintain that? Um, One of the things that we could argue that we do is that we have this positive self-talk, and we're kind of encouraged to have positive self-talk, right? Oh, I'm loved. Oh, I'm smart. Oh, I'm honest. Oh, I'm a winner. All of these things, and a lot of times it's because we've hyped ourselves up, and people around us have hyped us up. Most of us are around people who view us positively, and that helps to maintain this sense of self. There are some other theories, though, that are interesting when we think about our positive self concept. The first is self discrepancy theory, right? So it's this theory that we become distressed when our sense of who we are is discrepant, it differs, right, from our personal standards or our desired self concepts, our ideal self, or our ought self, right? So we could call it our ideal self, or we could call it our ought self, who we ought to be. Um, and so when there's this discrepancy between our actual self and our ideal self or ought self, um, how do we deal with that? How do we deal with the fact that we have failed to live up to standards? Well, if they're our own standards, right, and if they're our own sense of discrepancy between our actual and our ideal self, then we have this emotional discomfort, right? We have these feelings of dejection, we're sad, we're depressed, we have dissatisfaction, right? So yeah, you believe that you should, by the age of 25, be the next Mark Zuckerberg, and it turns out that you end up getting a job at Walmart and you're slaving away coding all day. So you didn't really make your standard for yourself. You believe that you should be the next Lewis Hamilton, a famous race car, F1 racing driver, who just won his seventh championship, and who unfortunately right now has COVID-19. Anyway, you believe that you're a great kart racer and that you're going to grow up to be the next Lewis Hamilton, and by the time you're 19, you're nowhere near the F1 circuit. You're not even in F2 or any of those races, and so you might feel this way. On the other hand, there are sometimes when we see this discrepancy of our actual self versus our ideal self that others have prescribed for us, right? So let's say you reach the age of 22 and you're taking you've done all your prereqs or whatever to get into med school, and you take the MCAT, which is the test that you are supposed to take to get into med school, and you get a really low score, and so you don't get admitted to med school. And what's important to you is that your parents wanted you to become a doctor, right? And so your actual self, you're not a doctor, you're not getting into med school, versus the ideal self that your parents see, you know, is problematic. What happens in those instances? Well, in those instances, we feel more anxiety related emotions. One of the things you'll notice right now about self discrepancy theory is that it helps us understand reasons that we might feel bad, reasons we might be depressed, reasons we might feel anxious, right? Maybe your mom expected you to be the next beauty pageant winner, and you were going to be the next Miss America, but instead it turns out, you never made it past the second circuit, which is sixth graders or something like this. I don't know. Yeah, you might feel some kind of way. You might be anxious or worried about that. So, self completion theory says that when we experience some threat to a value aspect of ourself, right, our identity, um, then we are highly motivated to seek social recognition of that identity. So, let's say you enter, they like to use cooking a lot in these examples, but say you enter a cooking contest because you know that you're an amazing cook, right? So you enter a contest to bake, apple pies because you know you're an amazing baker. And you go to the contest and you spend all day, and your family comes down to hear the results, and they announce a winner, and you don't even qualify in the top three. You are crushed, right? You know that you're an amazing baker, you've been baking your whole life, yada yada yada. What do you do? Well, what research tells us and what self completion theory tells us is that we would do everything in our power to be praised as a cook, and get some kind of social recognition. So we lost the contest, so we immediately go home and we make this magnificent feast for our family so that our family can say, "Oh, Cassandra, you're the best cook I've ever met. You're amazing. This creme brulee, I've never had anything better in my life," yada yada yada, right? And part of the reason is going back to this idea of a positive self concept, right? We want to maintain a positive self concept. So our self concept was a bit nipped when we didn't win in the cooking contest or the baking contest. So we immediately sought some way to be recognized as someone who is good in that chosen activity, in that identity based or linked. I think linked is a better word here. Contest, or I'm sorry, identity linked domain, I should say, or area, right? So in the case of the example that I used, the domain or the area is cooking, right, or baking. So we would make an attempt and be highly motivated to get some kind of recognition that we actually are good bakers, even though we lost the contest. Okay, so keeping on with our theories, our next theory is called self-evaluation maintenance theory. And so this theory says that our self-concept can be threatened by another's behavior. So far we've been really, with these theories, talking about how our own behavior can affect our self-concept. Self-evaluation maintenance theory says other people's behavior can threaten our self-concept. And the level of threat that we feel is usually determined by the closeness of the other person, right? Is it a close friend? Is it a lover? Is it a parent? Is it a sibling? So on and so forth. And the relevance of the behavior. So we talked about cooking in the last example. If cooking is important to you, this would increase the level of threat that you feel by the other individual's behavior. So according to self-evaluation maintenance theory, we feel bad when a close friend, or a close other, outperforms us on a task that is relevant to our self definition, to our identity, right? So if we consider ourselves a good cook and our close friend outperforms us in a cooking related area, we're going to feel bad. So go back to that cooking, the baking contest. You didn't win at all, but your best friend won. And you're like, holy, there's a word that ends with that phrase, but I'm not going to say it. You feel really bad, right? On the other hand, there is absolutely no problem if a close friend outperforms you on a task that's not relevant to your self definition. So, if you're a great baker and your friend is an amazing mathematician and they win some kind of math award, and you're like, yes, because you don't care, you don't do anything math related. So you're not thinking to yourself, man, I suck. You're like, man, that's amazing. That's my friend, right? And in fact, what happens is, and you can imagine, that you feel great about yourself when our friend does something good. I mean, you've experienced this when you're like, that's my girl, that's my boy. Yeah, yeah, because it allows us to bask in reflected glory, right? We get to do that. We get to barg, right? We talked about this in another lecture. But when a close friend does really well in something that has nothing to do with our own personal identity, we feel amazing and we feel amazingly happy for them. But we don't feel that way if it's something that's connected to our sense of self, which makes sense, right? And that's why it can be hard to be really good friends with your colleagues or your peers, because eventually, if you all are aiming for the same thing, if they outperform you, you might feel bad about yourself. So what do we do? So if a friend outperforms us in a domain or an area that we consider to be important to our sense of identity, our sense of self, what do we do? Well, there are three things, we usually do. Usually we do one of these things, but I guess you could do more than one. One thing that we do is we distance ourselves from the person, right? So your friend won that baking contest, and you're like, let me just not answer these calls for a minute. Let's not hang out, right? You guys have a chess tournament, go into a chess tournament or a poker tournament, and they outperform you and you're feeling bad. You're like, let me just take a little break from them. The second, you could do everything you can to improve your performance, right? So if it's a math competition or a poker tournament or a baking contest and you don't win and your friend does, you go home and you practice, 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 right? You burn the midnight oil trying to become the best mathematician or poker player or pie baker or whatever it is that you can be, so that next time you're the person who's on the stage, and not sitting in the crowd. Or the last thing you should do, of course, is reduce the relevance of that task, right? So you didn't win and your friend did, and you feel bad about yourself. You can just say, you know what, maybe I'm not the best baker. And in fact, baking isn't even important. This is kind of stupid. I need to get a new hobby, right? Something like that. So, another threat to our self concept or a threat to our self esteem happens when we behave in ways that are contrary to our attitudes, right? So, we have this cognitive dissonance because we behave in ways that are contrary to our existing attitudes. So, if that happens, how do we restore our self-esteem? So let's say we smoke, even though we know that smoking is a health hazard. Not only is it some level of cognitive dissonance, it impacts our self-esteem. We don't feel good about ourselves when we do that. If you think drugs are bad and you spent this weekend, because we're in Michigan, going to the weed shop and smoking an ounce or vaping or whatever it is, you choose to do. You ate some lovely muffins, however you get down. I don't know. I don't want to judge. I'm a judgment-free kind of woman. No one believes that but me, but I do believe that about myself. So however you get down, if you believe that drugs are bad, but you spent this time in Michigan getting high because you are in Michigan, and in Michigan it's legal, how do you feel? How do you restore your self-esteem after you've done something that you think is, contrary to your attitudes? Well, self affirmation theory suggests that we reduce the impact of the threat, the threat of feeling bad about ourselves, by affirming our competence in an unrelated area, right? So, oh, I feel so bad. I went and smoked an ounce of weed this weekend, and I think drugs are bad, but I did it with my friends because that's what they were doing, and it's legal here, but I still think it's bad. What should I do? What should I do? What should I do? Well, you might do something like, yes, I smoked this ounce, but at the same time, you know what? I happened on Sunday to spend all day cleaning up my house, right? You could say, you know what? I'm an amazing cleaner, right? So that's your competence in an unrelated area. You were thinking about cleaning, your discrepancy was related to drugs. Or you could say something like, I am going to jog every day this week for my health, right? You affirm that you're competent when it comes to maintaining your health because you feel bad about the discrepancy between, your view on drugs and doing drugs. So, what's really interesting is that when it comes to self affirmation theory, the people who tend to do it most are the people who already had high self esteem to begin with. So, what you would think intuitively, I think most of us would think, is that people with low self esteem actually engage with self affirmation. They do something wrong, their sense of self is really hurt, and so they go ahead and self affirm. Well, it turns out what really happens is that people who already have high self esteem go ahead and self affirm. And if you think about it, this makes sense. What they say in terms of the literature is that if you want to have high self esteem, or if you want to think about what marks or kind of stands out about people with high self esteem, one of the things is that they tend to um, accept themselves, right? So they engage in self acceptance quite a bit. So for people with high self esteem, they would look at this failing, oh, I don't believe in drugs, but I smoke drugs. They would say something like, it's okay, right? Like people do things sometimes that they don't agree with, it's fine, and then affirm themselves in something different to maintain that high self esteem, right? Whereas, from my point of view, sometimes people with lower self esteem don't engage in activities that would strengthen their self esteem. I'm not saying it's true for all people, nor am I saying it's true for all activities or tasks that we're thinking about, but sometimes that is the case. And then the last theory that I'm going to talk about is self-enhancement theory. Well, that I'm going to talk about in this kind of section of the lecture is self-enhancement theory. So, according to self-enhancement theory, one way that we feel good about ourselves is to distort or exaggerate our positive qualities. And we do that uh, through a self-enhancement process. And the self enhancement process can be different for pretty much all of us or any of us. But at the end of the day, self enhancement theory says that we tend to hold these unrealistically positive views about ourselves, right? If you ask people how intelligent they are, most people would say that they're above average. But the fact of the matter is that there is an average. And because there is an average, 50% of us have to be below that average. But we don't think of things like that. And you can see this guy right now in the picture or in the slide, he's kind of flexing his muscles. And in his view, he looks like his shadow. But the reality is he, looks like himself. And we all do this. We kind of distort our positive qualities to enhance ourselves. And research shows that it makes us feel better, right? We distort reality to paint this flattering picture of ourselves, and when you do that, you tend to have this higher self-esteem. So one thing that stands out to me personally thinking about something like this is this the reason that we Photoshop ourselves? Is this the reason that we have these kind of I don't really do this, I'm not on social media, but that people and kind of celebrities who are also people, um, uh, post these pictures of themselves where they, subtract the negatives, enhance the positives, recreate themselves, and all these other things. And, I always wonder, when I see pictures that are obviously photoshopped, if people doing this feel good about the fact that they're showing a photoshopped image. And according to self enhancement theory, they do. What I find interesting, though, or what I think would actually be interesting to me, because I shouldn't say what I find interesting. I should say I find this interesting because to me, doing this, photoshopping yourselves, and going and even making the attempt to Photoshop yourself, to me sounds like it's an admission that you don't like the way you look, or an admission that you consider yourself um, not that great, and so you feel the need to Photoshop yourself. And self enhancement theory actually says the opposite, right? Self enhancement theory actually says we feel so good about ourselves that we feel good sending out a picture of our best self, right? And maybe it's because when we think about ourselves, we really don't think about these details that would take away from how great we think we are, right? So maybe when the girl on the bottom here thinks about herself, she pictures herself as this beautiful woman who actually doesn't have acne, even though she's the same beautiful woman with acne. Let me be clear about that part. But she might think that, posting herself without acne is the right thing to do because that's not really how she views herself, because society doesn't view acne to be that great. So I always think of, and this is no shade toward her, so I don't want anybody sending me emails about this, but I always think of someone like uh, one of the who's the one, Khloe Kardashian. I always think of someone like Khloe Kardashian, right? So we all know that Khloe Kardashian posts these images of herself on social media that look literally not like her, not even a little bit. Like they are so far. Like this lady slims down her face. She just does some stuff, right? And so I always think, wow, I mean, every time I do that, I would feel really bad about myself. But maybe that's just not the case. But I also think that I would feel bad about myself because I have a kid, and I would be showing my kid that, like, who you actually are isn't good enough. But again, self enhancement theory says I'm thinking about this completely wrong, right? So, from a literature standpoint, self enhancement theory would say that how I view selfies and how I view photoshopping selfies is actually incorrect, right? So, the way that I'm thinking about selfies is just not quite right. Self enhancement theory would say that people who are photoshopping themselves uh, are feeling better about themselves, right? And it helps our self esteem. So there you go. Last thing, and then I'll move on to a different topic. Self enhancement, right? This desire to think of ourselves as better who we are, yada yada, is a Western phenomena, right? It normally happens in Western cultures. Please remember that. In Asian cultures, what we find is something different. In Asian cultures, rather than self enhancement, they tend to have self effacement, meaning they view themselves more negatively. Hine and Renshaw in 2002, I want to say 22, but I struggle real hard with that. 22. No, 2002 found American students perceive themselves more positively than their friends perceive them, right? We self enhance. On the other hand, Japanese students perceive themselves more negatively than their friends perceive them. So remember again, self enhancement is a Western phenomena. In Asian cultures, typically what you'll get is self-effacement, which is, humility and modesty and meekness. Um, Not to be religious, but the Bible says, "Blessed are the meek," right? The Beatitudes. For those of you who are uh, familiar with the Bible. Anyway, so something to consider and something to think about. So, one thing that tends to be true is that we have multiple selves or different components or role identities that are active at specific times. So, at certain times, you may have the role identity that's most predominant of a mother or a father or a child or a student. Again, according to identity research, we have several different identities, right? We have several different labels. Maybe you're a member of this community or that community, but usually certain identities are more prominent depending on specific contexts, different times. When I go back home, I'm definitely a member of a family, right? I'm a daughter, I'm a sister, I'm a cousin, I'm a niece, these kind of things. Um, and so my role identity is somewhat different. When I walk into the business school, I'm a faculty member, and so my role identity is somewhat different. Based on whatever role identity you have that is primarily activated at the time, you may prefer certain products and services, right? So when I'm a faculty member, I'm much more likely when I walk in the building to decide to have coffee. One thing about me that's generally true is that I don't drink coffee that often, on average, maybe once a week. And I primarily drink it when other people invite me to coffee, and that's usually my colleagues, right? If I'm at home by myself and I were drinking something to stimulate me, it would probably be a Mountain Dew Kickstart, which I try not to have in my house, but that doesn't always work. So some identities are more central than others, meaning they're more important to you, they're more intense, and you respond more to them. Again, so maybe being a parent is very central to a consumer, right? So once you become a parent, your ability to operate changes, right? You're more paternal or maternal. You're more in tune with what your child needs. And so the identity as a parent is very strong in you. It could be that when you get your very first job after college, going to work in corporate or trying to start your own business, whatever you decide to do, is very central to your identity, and that maybe that'll fade over time as you do things like start a family, so on and so forth. Um, but remember, other identities may be more dominant in certain situations. Maybe when you get together with your high school friends, then your identity as the person you were in high school is dominant when you're with those people. Maybe when you're with your parents, your identity as a child is more prominent, so on and so forth. Talked about the extended self before, that there are objects that we consider to be a part of us that compromise what we consider our extended self. Things that are so important to our sense of self that they are an extension of our sense of self. So we talked about it via kind of a lecture before, and one of the things that I mentioned on an individual level was cell phones. So on an individual level, our cell phone is often an extension of ourself, right? So our personal possessions, in this case, I would argue a cell phone. It could very well be that for some consumers, a car might be an extension of their sense of self. Maybe kind of their house, maybe a degree, but most of those things, I would say, less so for the average consumer. On the other hand, I would say absolutely a cell phone. At the family level, it may be, again, your home and your furnishings may be considered an extension of who you consider yourself to be, right? So maybe you grew up in this neighborhood, maybe you had this type of house and this type of furniture, and those things are an extension of your sense of self. At a community level, It could be your neighborhood or your town. It's really interesting to think about that in a place like Detroit. So this is going on my second year in Detroit, and I noticed that people seem to be very proud of being from Detroit. And so you could argue that Detroit is an extension of their sense of self. I won't kind of make the joke that always kind of makes me laugh, and that is how many people claim Detroit when they've never really lived in Detroit. It's kind of funny. And then last but not least, you might have group level extended self. So your social groups, maybe maybe you're a part of a small community that speaks a specific language. Maybe you're part of a small community that, watches a specific television show, who knows. But these kind of things may be considered an extension of yourself. So typically, when discussing self-concept, there's a lot of slides that look at body positivity. Fortunately or unfortunately for you, I've tried to intersperse that throughout the semester. But that said, I do want to ask this question: how does body positivity affect consumption, right? And then does body positivity have the same effects on consumption for men, right? We've seen the body positivity movement, like I've said before, geared towards women, but what about body positivity efforts geared towards men? We can argue that body positivity is great for consumption. It's great for individuals because people feel like they can wear what they want and they can use the makeup that they want and all of these things. Some people will come back and say, well, body positivity may not be perfect because it might ignore health concerns, or it might convince people to go ahead and eat that extra slice of cheesecake, or so on and so forth. And so something to think about when you're thinking about body positivity and consumption. So when we think about the idea of self-concept and we think about consumption, there are some things to know. One, research has confirmed that consumers usually buy products related to their self-concept. And specifically, respondents tend to prefer brands they rate similar to themselves. So people may buy a John Deere tractor because they feel as though John Deere as a brand expresses similar values or ideals, or other things that is similar to that consumer. Some people may really have an affinity for Coke for a very similar reason. One thing about me is that I tend to, well, not tend to, I a couple of years ago started collecting Barbies. So if you come to my office, you'll see some Barbies that I've collected. And I don't necessarily think I do it because I think Barbie as a whole relates to my self-concept. I do it more so that because they started creating dolls that I think are a little bit closer to my self-concept, dolls that look more like me, and I appreciate that. And it shows, beauty in all different forms. Some people might like Ford, they may prefer McDonald's, so on and so forth. And so again, I've talked about in class before that people prefer advertisements that have consumers that look like them. They prefer movies with consumers that look like them. This is somewhat different, right? This is saying that you identify with a brand. You believe a brand is similar to you, and therefore you have a particular affinity with that brand. And so one thing we could all think about is, what brands would that be true of for us? Brands that I have a particularly strong affinity for, I really like the Body Shop. I have one. I just thought of this. I don't know if I think it's similar to me, but I have a blender, the Ninja, and it actually just broke in my dishwasher today. Sad for me, but I love my Ninja blender. It's probably the best blender I've ever had, and it's been with me for about 5 years. So I have an affinity for that. I'm not sure that I think the brand is similar to me, but I'm sure there are brands that I think are similar to me. But kind of what are your ideas here? So if we look at this figure, it talks about the relationship between self-concept and brand image influence. So for a product or brand image, and then the consumer concept, what ends up happening? Well, from a behavior standpoint, we tend to seek products and brands that improve or maintain our self-concept. And we tend to be satisfied with purchases that contribute to our desired self concept, right? So, what that ends up doing is just reinforcing our self concept, right? So, when we determine satisfaction based on whether a purchase contributes to our self concept or our desired self concept, I should say, that tends to just reinforce who we believe ourselves to be. So it's kind of a loop. Well, it is a loop, but it's kind of interesting to think of satisfaction in that manner, right? At least I think so. So there's a theory, symbolic self-completion theory, that suggests that people who have an incomplete self-definition tend to complete their self-definition or identity by acquiring and displaying symbols associated with that identity, right? So adolescent boys, those who are aged 13 to 17, try to use macho products like cars or cigarettes, baseball caps, whatever you consider macho in this instance, to kind of help complete their sense of a macho identity. What will probably happen is that when you get your first corporate job, to help complete the identity of a corporate person, you will go out and splurge on a brand new full wardrobe of business clothing and kind of a briefcase and all these other things. But you can think about this in a lot of ways. We could also take this to adolescent girls. We can take this to apprentices, and all kinds of groups who do this, where we buy clothes to complete our self-definition. Not clothes, I'm sorry, things, where we buy things to help complete our self-definition, right? If we go back to this idea of adolescence, whether they're boys or girls, they might buy cigarettes to kind of look cool because they want to have a identity that's associated with coolness. College students might drink a lot of alcohol for the same reason, right? To kind of complete this cool identity. So, I talked before about this idea of the extended self, how there's certain possessions that are an extension of who you are, like your cell phone might fall under that category. And I talked about the idea that Russell Belk, a famous marketing scholar, has done a lot of research on this. What's really interesting isn't just kind of this idea of extended self and some products like merging into your identity. It's this idea that consumers use consumption behavior to make judgment decisions about another person's social identity. So consumers who see you on the street will look at your clothing, your grooming habits, the activities that you do, leisure activities, your food preferences, the type of car you drive, to make judgments about the type of person you are. If you are the person who drives a Maserati versus the person who drives a Honda hatchback, people will look at that and make some inferences about who you are. And I say people, but we all do that, right? It's just kind of human nature to do that. Um, we also look at products as contributing to our sense of self for ourselves. We often don't think that, right? We often think, I bought this purse or I bought these shoes. We don't necessarily think that they contribute to our social identity or our identity or and sense of self until we lose those possessions. And so what you'll see is in disasters, floods, hurricanes, tornadoes, those kind of things, people will say that they feel as though they've lost their sense of self, right? So even though when we have those products, we don't feel as though they contribute to our identity, often when we lose those products, either to natural disaster or they're stolen or whatever, that we consider them to be a part of ourselves. When you even hear people on the news after going through a natural disaster, they look lost, right? They often are very just kind of numb, and in a lot of cases they feel as though who they are is gone, and a lot of times it's because they've lost all of their things. So most consumers demonstrate a congruence between their values and the things they buy, right? Um, so there are models that suggest that when attributes match um, between a product and some aspect of the self, a person is more likely to buy that product, right? So when the product demonstrates a characteristic that you think is associated with yourself, you're more likely to buy that product. So maybe you're looking at this DKNY ad that's on the bottom right hand corner and you think, wow, this is a sexy ad. I think I'm sexy, so I'm going to buy this DKNY, similar to the I Am Juicy Couture, right? Or maybe you think these products are kind of eye-catching and I'm eye-catching and so I should buy it, something like this. You could also think that a product is rugged, right? So many people will buy certain products because they think they're rugged and they think the product is rugged, they think they're rugged, and so they buy the product. So I talk about this idea of self-product congruence, but the question becomes, what self are we talking about? Our ideal self or our actual self being in congruence or matching the product that we're interested in? What we tend to find is that when we're thinking about relevant products and or products that are relevant for every day or functional products, we want them to match our actual self, right? So when we're thinking about whether what kind of product to buy for cleaning our bathroom or a coat that we wear every day for winter, right? We want that to match the product itself to match our actual self. So the characteristics of that product should match our actual self. So maybe we think that we're tough and so we like Clorox because we think that it's tough, right? Maybe we think that we like products that are durable and so we like this coat because we think it's durable and these are relevant everyday products that match our actual self. On the other hand, when we're thinking about highly expressive products like perfume or expensive tennis shoes, we want them to match our ideal self, right? So let's say my ideal self is super classy, and so I like Gucci coats. Right, I want my ideal self is super classy, so I go after something that matches a product that matches the super classy ideal self, and that might be a Gucci coat. Maybe my ideal self is kind of super sophisticated, and so I go after red bottom shoes, let's say, or you could use, perfume or expensive tennis shoes. But again, you want the self and the product to be congruent, and when it's highly expressive products, you want it to be in congruence, ideal self product congruence, and when it's relevant everyday products, you want it to be your actual self in product congruence. So marketers should target their products to consumers within the context of a particular self. So for example, I am a social drinker who is actually actively trying not to drink. So I'm a social drinker who's just trying to be like a non-drinker. Yet, if you want to advertise liquor, you should do so socially for me, right? So seeing an ad when I'm at home does nothing, but maybe if I'm out at a bar with friends, seeing ads for liquor products or alcoholic products is a really big deal. Maybe we could expand on that and think about drugs, right? Um, if you are thinking about how to get people not to use drugs, because I would never suggest that we think about how to get people to use drugs. We don't do that in this class. But if you're thinking about how to get people to not use drugs, maybe you don't have these ads that pop up when they're at home with their parents, right? Maybe you try to kind of place ads around college campuses or have people around college campuses wear t-shirts or that kind of say no to drugs or something like that, because then you can target people in, a context that's relevant to that particular self, if that makes sense to you. So when we think about kind of wrapping this up, The products and services that we consume help us define our self-concept and our social identity or our identity. Um, they also affect other people's perceptions of us. It's common for us to judge people based on their possessions, so their clothing, their makeup, automobile, their home, their leisure activities, the service they consume. There's research called this looking glass self. And basically, the looking glass self is really interesting because it says that we derive our self concept by considering how other people see us, right? So you don't just kind of come up with a self concept. Really, how these people see you help create who you are, right? Um, which is really interesting when you think about that, like how your mom and dad see you. They might see you as an angel, but how your ex girlfriend sees you, they might see you as a devil. And both of those things will go into kind of helping create your self concept. Last but not least, consumers tend to buy products and services that complement and enhance their self image, right? We always want to enhance our self image, most consumers do. Um, This is useful in things like in areas like market segmentation, right? If we know that consumers want to enhance their self image, we can identify consumers who are likely to want to enhance their self image with certain products and then create a segment for those consumers. Um, and then last but not least, we can try to market or segment markets into groups who have similar self images. That can be a little bit more tricky, but I would argue that data analytics helps with that. I would also argue that when companies ask you to complete surveys, that helps with that, right? If we really want to know a consumer self image, we can ask them different questions to come up with that. But we have to be on the ball when we do that, right? So some marketers just try to look at things like zip codes. Where are you from? But there are others who are really interested in kind of what your self image is to kind of target that self image. I would argue that makeup companies do this. I would also make a really strong argument that car companies do this. I mean, if you look at a Ford commercial, yeah, so Ford tough, sure, but they are also kind of trying to think about your self-image or kind of, I guess, hint towards your self-image, right? This idea that Ford is tough and you're tough because you use Ford, so on and so forth.